Today on the APUSHow, we're looking at Chapter 31, From the Age of Limits to the Age of Reagan. Well, I know that, Taft. I mean, the age when he was president. Thank you, Taft. Thank you for letting us know that Ronald Reagan wasn't dead when he was president. We really appreciate that. We look at politics and diplomacy after Watergate. Was it all water under the bridge, or was it water sitting in a gate? We'll look at the rise of the new American right. Hopefully it isn't anything like this old American right, because my labrum is a little sore and throwing stuff kinda hurts. We're gonna look at the Reagan Revolution. Hopefully it's better than a ragin' revolution, because that seems mighty angry, eh, Taft? We'll look at America and the waning of the Cold War. Sheesh, it was already a Cold War. Could it get any more cold and dead than that? We shall see this week and more on the APUSHow. Our examination of the so-called Age of Limits and the Age of Reagan. Yes, thank you, Taft. 110 years old. We got it. But anyway, the major event of the 1970s, politically speaking, was the Watergate scandal, which saw the ousting of President Richard Nixon for trying to cover up his own agents stealing secrets from the Watergate office building of the George McGovern campaign. We shall see how the nation tried to recover from this as it... Taft still hasn't recovered from the Watergate scandal. He's still trying to deal with this breach of trust, as many Americans tried to deal with it as well in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Vice President and former college football superstar for the University of Michigan, Gerald Ford, would step in after Nixon's resignation, and one of his most pressing issues was what to do about Richard Nixon, who had broken the law. Obstruction of justice and abuse of power are very serious crimes, and had he been convicted of said crimes, Nixon would face years in federal prison, which was the desire of many Americans. And considering that our nation was founded on the idea of the rule of law and no one being above it, a trial and potential conviction is certainly what Nixon deserved. But Nixon wasn't convicted, nor did he even go to a trial, because a month into the Ford presidency, Ford issued a full, free, and absolute pardon for the disgraced former president. Many Americans would continue to lose hope for redemption for the American people or a president with integrity. Along with his inability or unwillingness to persecute Nixon, Ford would also preside over a recession in 1974 and 1975, as rising oil prices and the continued decline of American manufacturing would drive the country further into the depths of an economy that was both stagnant and inflated, also known as stagflation. But Ford would have some diplomatic success as the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the same Secretary of State of Richard Nixon, was able to begin to broker a deal for further nuclear disarmament with the Soviet Union and yet another secured arms limitation talk, or SALT II. Kissinger also managed to ensure more peaceful relations in the Middle East, as he would arrange for an agreement between Egypt and Israel in which Israel would exchange land taken from Egypt in the Yom Kippur War. But the struggling economy, the Nixon scandal, and perceived appeasement with the Soviets all would bode poorly for Ford, as he would face opposition from inside and outside his own party. He would narrowly beat Republican challenger Ronald Reagan in 1976, who would nearly beat Ford by running a campaign on the idea that Ford was not tough enough on the Russians. But the seemingly calm, peaceful, honest, and incorruptible Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter was able to narrowly defeat Ford in 1976 with 297 electoral votes to Ford's 240. Carter received 50% of the popular vote, whereas Ford only got about 48%. No, Taft, it's actually not true. It's not true that Jimmy Carter was history's greatest monster. Jimmy Carter, the honest outsider slash non-monster, took office after the 1976 election with the nation mired with incredibly complex and worrying issues. The economy was a mess with runaway unemployment and inflation, along with an American public deeply distrustful of the American government. Though Carter was extremely intelligent, he failed largely to provide his mostly Georgia-staffed administration with a clear direction for the nation moving forward. To deal with unemployment, Carter would institute large amounts of government spending and would also issue tax cuts. This did work to a degree in terms of unemployment, but with continued crises in the Middle East and increased prices by the ever-spiteful oil-rich Arab nations of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, oil and gas prices continued to rise, driving up inflation. In the summer of 1979, Carter attempted to dress a nation on the brink. He would present a series of proposals on how to address the energy crisis, but would also stark levy criticism on the American people, claiming that Americans suffered from a crisis of confidence that threatened the very heart and soul of our national will. The speech would be henceforth known as Carter's Malaise speech, and would signal the beginning of the end of his time as president. Carter would learn the hard way that 20th century Americans don't like to be called scared, and to imply that the United States of America is anything short of exceptionally amazing is to ensure that Americans will vote for someone else who does think that they're exceptionally amazing. Carter would also pledge to engage in foreign policy that focused on respect for human rights rather than selfish interests. And though Carter would speak harshly against countries who had committed violations of human rights, most of his foreign policy actions were relatively traditional. He arranged for a treaty that would return the Panama Canal over to the control of the Panamanians. He would also improve relations with the Soviet Union and also China, who were beginning their own gradual rise to their current status as one of the economic powers of the world. And he would work towards sustained peace in the Middle East. In the Camp David Accords, Carter was able to arrange for peace talks between the Israelis and the Egyptians, as he was able to arrange for a summit between Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat at the presidential retreat at Camp David. During this summit, Carter was able to get the leaders of the two embattled Middle Eastern rivals to agree to an Egypt-Israeli peace treaty. It's still regarded as a major achievement in foreign policy by Jimmy Carter. But much like his domestic policies, Carter's foreign policies were beset with complex problems that he was unable to solve. First, Iran would prove to be the end of Carter's chances of winning re-election in 1980. Iran for decades had been under the control of Shah Reza Pahlavi, a dictator who was essentially installed by the United States after the United States would use the CIA to overthrow the popular but Soviet-leaning Iranian leader Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s. The Shah was able to keep Iran relatively peaceful, friendly with the United States, and most importantly, not friendly with the Soviet Union. However, the Shah was also very repressive and promoted a more westernized secular society, which would foster a great deal of resentment and outrage from the more religious and conservative Iranian public. Iranian religious leaders would help lead a revolution in Iran and would depose of the Shah in 1979, forcing him to flee the country. Iran would devolve into revolutionary chaos, with the slim degree of leadership provided by religious clerics under the influence of the fanatic religious leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. However, the situation became markedly more hostile between Iran and the United States when word got out that the Shah was seeking medical treatment for cancer in New York City. In response to this, armed Iranian militants would seize the U.S. embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran and would take dozens of American diplomats and military staffers hostage. The Iranian hostage crisis would last for over a year. Adding to this foreign policy disaster was yet another disaster in Afghanistan, as Soviet forces would attempt to take over the country and install yet another Soviet satellite government. In response, Carter would withdraw from the SALT II agreements, impose sanctions on the Soviets, and would institute a boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. Though Afghanistan would prove to basically be the Soviet Union's own Vietnam, in that they tried to influence the government of a nation, failed, and lost a ton of money and lives in the process, Afghanistan, Iran, malaise, inflation, and unemployment would all ultimately doom any chance for Carter's re-election in 1980. The United States in the 20th century is often described as a very pendulous time in which there's kind of a pendulum that swings from the United States being a more conservative country and a more liberal country. And that pendulum seemed to swing more towards the conservative sides in the mid-1970s as Americans were really tired of Vietnam protests, the Vietnam War itself, all sorts of racial tumult, and of course a federal government that was proven to be very corrupt. People felt that the nation was heading towards hell in a handbasket. Sorry, Taft. Heck in a handbasket. Needless to say, a lot of Americans yearn for a new approach that embraced more law, order, and perhaps some Jesus. Taft, I don't think you know what Jesus is. No, Taft. Jesus is not a type of cheese. One of the major epicenters of the American rise of the right in the 1970s was the region of the country known as the Sun Belt. It's called the Sun Belt because it's literally the sunny strip of land that extends from California to Texas all the way to Georgia and the Carolinas on the East Coast. On a map, it kind of looks like a belt. Well, the Sun Belt was a region of considerable growth in the 1950s and 60s. California would become the country's most populous state in 1964, and the rest of the region would also experience considerable growth. However, it would also foster a great deal of resentment for the federal government as the increased taxation and regulation of the land angered many. Though the region benefited the most from federal development, it would become the birthplace of the Sagebrush Rebellion, in which Sunbelt citizens would oppose federal ownership of land, environmental laws, and restrictions on development. The conservative movement would also grow in suburban areas where increasingly isolated and homogenized communities would become more focused on addressing issues facing their own relatively small communities rather than issues facing the state of their country. And of course, one can't talk about the conservative revival of the 70s and 80s without mentioning the revival of evangelical Christianity. Despite the predictions of many social theorists, religion in the United States persisted and to a large degree even began to thrive in the 1970s and 80s as the United States witnessed the largest religious rebirth since the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. At the heart of this movement was the idea of evangelical Christianity, which is essentially the idea of having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and God. Though the evangelical belief of saving people through religious rebirth or being born again with a direct relationship with Jesus was nothing terribly new, more Americans sought understanding through faith as many were disturbed by the chaos of the 60s and 70s, what with race riots, Vietnam, protests, a federal government run by crooks, the removal of certain religious institutions like prayer and school, the removal of federal funding for religious schools, the disruption of traditional patriarchal families, the legalization of abortion in Roe v. Wade, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, and a worsening economy. Religion became a focal point for many political aims as Catholics, Mormons, and evangelical Christians became increasingly aware of their growing power and influence over American politics. But evangelical Christians would not be the only piece of the growing conservative coalition. In the 1960s, we had the New Left, and given the pendulous nature of the American political right and left both taking turns being in charge, the 70s would see the emergence of the so-called New Right. The New Right had its origins with the campaign of Barry Goldwater, who ran as a hardline conservative in the 1964 election that was won decisively by Lyndon Johnson. However, the same group of conservatives that supported Goldwater would continue to build their coalition and would rally around the growing popularity of the former actor-turned-politician Ronald Reagan. Reagan was fairly liberal in his youth, but after years of embattling communists within the Screen Actors Guild, marrying a staunch conservative in Nancy Davis, and becoming an increasingly popular and well-paid spokesperson for more right-wing corporations and organizations, Reagan would become more conservative and would become a leading voice from the right. Reagan would win the race for governor in California in 1966 and would mount growing pressure on the more moderate wings of the Republican Party. He would narrowly defeat Gerald Ford as a larger degree of Republicans grew tired of their own party being seen as soft on the Soviets, soft on Vietnam, and soft on people who resisted military service. The Republican Party had begun to shift to the right and had found a nearly perfect candidate to lead the nation in this shift. One of the most successful strategies the Republican Party was able to employ was the attack on taxes. And here's the thing, nobody likes to pay taxes. I don't like to pay taxes, and I have to pay a cheese tax every time I try to open up and eat a bag of cheese. This cheese tax is outrageous. When am I going to get my government cheese? Just another Illinois fat cat taking all the money from the people for himself. You're right, Taft. I need to do better, and I apologize. But for years, Republicans struggled to attack the many liberal programs that people depended on and thusly associated with the Democratic Party. But in Proposition 13 in California, the Republicans found their strategy. Proposition 13 was a referendum question in the 1978 statewide election in California. The proposition aimed to roll back state property taxes, which succeeded. Across the country, conservatives would launch campaign after campaign attacking taxes and accusing those who initiated the taxes as corrupt. Here, the Republican Party was able to separate the taxes, which no one likes to pay, from the programs the tax had funded, which a huge amount of people liked and needed. In many cases, Democrats would make it easy to separate the issue of taxation from the government programs they funded, as cities and states across the country would routinely mismanage or flat out steal tax dollars, and so badly blurred the lines between the taxes people paid and the benefits people received. To this day, one of the main avenues for success for conservative political campaigns is to attack taxes and attack those who wish to raise taxes. In the run-up to the 1980 election, Americans were incredibly frustrated with the Carter administration's inability to force Iran to release American hostages. That, along with the crisis in Afghanistan and the poor health of the American economy, Carter was in real trouble. He would nearly lose the Democratic primary to the third Kennedy brother, Massachusetts Senator Edward Kennedy, and would proceed to get absolutely walloped in the general election by Ronald Reagan. Americans gravitated towards the incredibly telegenic and assured message of Ronald Reagan, who pledged American strength abroad, lower taxes, and profound respect for the idea of American values. Reagan would win 51% of the popular vote and would win a staggering 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. Republicans would also win the Senate for the first time in nearly 30 years, though Democrats would retain the control of the House. The Republican Revolution of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s was firmly underway. And Reagan ran his campaign promising the most ambitious and largest amount of change in the American federal government that people had seen since the New Deal. And though he had very limited success in terms of implementing these policies, he did have a tremendous amount of success in terms of crafting a public persona of him being the figurehead and leader of the new American political right. Ronald Reagan would owe his political success to a new and somewhat odd political coalition that he managed to unite for his own support in the 1980s. His most influential group were the corporate elites, who were massively powerful and wealthy leaders of the corporate and finance sectors of the American economy. Consequently, Reagan ran on a platform that firmly supported these predominantly rich white men's agenda, which was the idea that the business market is the only true and fair way to solve most of the problems of the nation and the world, and that certain quote-unquote redistributive policies of the federal government must be opposed at all cost. Here we see sort of the same pro-business approach as we saw earlier in the 1920s, but with a much more open view of a free, market-based, and very global economy. In addition to the corporate elites, Reagan would also heavily rely on a smaller but yet incredibly powerful group known as the neoconservatives. Neoconservatives were for the most part mostly an intellectual group that would form think tanks, consultant agencies, and establish roots in academia. Their outlook was for the most part in line with the same pro-business model espoused by corporate elites, but with an additional emphasis on reaffirming the global dominance of Western countries against communist and otherwise non-American interests. Later on, neoconservatives would also lead the charge against the push for multiculturalism and political correctness. Lastly, you also had populist conservatives, and here's where things get a little bit unusual. Populist conservatives were for the most part rural, suburban, working, and middle-class white Americans from the South, Midwest, and Southwest. These conservatives were deeply resentful and fearful of the rich and powerful members of the government that they felt wished to take away their freedoms as individuals and as communities. They were predominantly white, so they would also express intense opposition for any sort of government programming aimed at correcting any sort of racial injustices rooted in American history. Instead, they would advocate that society must do this on its own without government interference. You know, kind of like how Southern schools in the 1950s and 60s would integrate on their own without government interference. Not. They would express intense distrust for the so-called Eastern elites, but that often complicated things with the corporate elites of the Reagan coalition, who often worked closely with Eastern elites and were often Eastern elites themselves. Yet despite this natural discord between the populace and the elites, the magnetic personality of Reagan brought these two groups together to form one of the most powerful political coalitions of the 20th century. As president, Reagan was the oldest president the country ever had up to that point. He was old and often seemed out of touch with his own administration's policy. However, as a former actor, he had one of the most remarkably well-crafted public personas the nation had ever seen. He was a master at appearing presidential and inspiring confidence on camera. He spoke incredibly well and, despite his age, often appeared spry and almost youthful on camera, as he would often be filmed on horseback on his ranch doing other assorted ranch things like chopping wood or doing stuff with hay. He would also survive an assassination attempt in 1981 with remarkable courage and toughness, as he joked with paramedics on the way to the hospital and had a full, complete, and incredibly speedy recovery. In terms of Reagan's economic policy, he would become most well known for his approach known as supply-side economics, or Reaganomics. Reaganomics was in many ways the antithesis to Keynesian economics, which was demand-side economics. Where John Maynard Keynes wanted to increase government spending in order to ensure high consumer demand, Reagan wanted to decrease government spending and taxation to allow people to have more money to spend on their businesses and grow the economy that way. Reagan, and more accurately the economists he hired within his administration, believed that the problems of the economy were because people, and most importantly corporations, were taxed too heavily and thus often didn't have enough money to grow. Because of this, Reagan, and conveniently his large cadre of business and finance executives who stood to profit handsomely from a supply-side economic approach, believed that the American economy would only be saved if taxes were slashed and government spending was also slashed. Consequently, numerous government programs and agencies were cut and staffs reduced as the government sought to deregulate numerous aspects of American life. The Environmental Protection Agency was weakened, which allowed protected lands and waterways to be opened up for development. Transportation agencies were weakened, so government regulations on vehicle emissions would be either ignored or removed, and also certain laws and policies regarding business and finance would be relaxed, which would give corporations a greater deal of freedom to conduct business in ways that were profitable, though perhaps not healthy in the long term for the American economy or American morality. Though his policies were initially unsuccessful as the economy sank into a recession in early 1982, it quickly rebounded as, by late 1983, unemployment dropped from 11% to 8.2% and continued to decline thereafter. The gross national product also increased by 3.6% that year, while inflation also had fallen below 5%. But Reagan's spending and tax cuts were not enough to assuage American fears regarding an impending fiscal crisis. Reagan promised to balance the federal budget within 4 years, but by cutting taxes and increasing spending on the military, the Reagan administration would actually rack up the largest amount of debt in 8 years that the American government had accumulated in its history. To alleviate this, certain welfare programs would be cut, as the Reagan administration felt that because of the massive amount of spending in healthcare and anti-poverty entitlement programs, the economy was mired in deficits and debt. But these policies proved ineffective in solving the issues of debt, as massive military defense spending and tax cuts would cause the debt to increase. However, the reduction of welfare benefits did succeed in raising the American poverty rate to its highest in 20 years, as nearly 15% of Americans lived in poverty. Like his domestic policies, Reagan had a very mixed and dangerous bag when it came to his foreign policy. As a governor and political candidate, Reagan expressed dismay at any sort of peaceful or conciliatory dealings with the Soviet Union, a nation he once referred to as the quote-unquote evil empire. He hated the strategic arms limitation talks, but would honor their provisions for the most part. He would, however, develop the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. SDI would also be known as Star Wars, as it aimed to use satellites and lasers to stop nuclear missiles from reaching their destinations. Hey Taft, you a big Star Wars guy? No, you can't eat Star Wars. The Soviet Union and many others the world over were greatly concerned about the prospect of lasers, satellites, and nuclear missiles flying around said lasers and satellites, and would push for a nuclear freeze in an effort to avert potential nuclear annihilation of the Earth. But the Soviet Union aside, Reagan would take a rather aggressive approach toward intervention when it came to countries flirting with communism. The Reagan doctrine was essentially the mindset that any country that appeared to be adopting communism must be dealt with regardless of the fact if the people there determined for themselves if they wanted communism. As a result, American Marines would hit the ground to prevent communist or Marxist movements in Grenada and Nicaragua, and American aid and espionage would be employed to numerous other efforts throughout the world to stem the growth of communism and anti-American interests. Marines would also work to drive out anti-Israeli guerrillas in Lebanon, but in response to this, Americans in Lebanon became targets for a terrorist attack in 1983 that left 241 Marines dead. As a result, Reagan would pull American forces from Lebanon rather than become more entangled in the situation. Acts of terrorism against the United States would become more and more frequent as powerless people throughout the world would object to various aspects of American intervention into their lives. With no viable means to resist said interventions, much weaker nations and political groups would engage in acts of terrorism against the United States. Americans would watch in horror as people in faraway lands would engage in terrorist activities like attacking American cruise ships, airplanes, American commercial and diplomatic facilities abroad, or seizing hostages as terrorist attacks became an increasingly common and alarming occurrence. Heading into the 1984 election, Reagan maintained his position as the unquestioned leader of the Republican Party that firmly coalesced around his candidacy. Democrats were much less unified, as the former Vice President Walter Mondale won a contested nomination fending off challenges from Senator Gary Hart of Colorado and the dynamic civil rights leader Jesse Jackson. Reagan would again cruise to victory, winning 59% of the popular vote and winning every state except for Mondale's home state of Minnesota. His party did not share the same degree of dominance, as they would lose a seat in the Senate and Democrats would maintain control of the House. Next, we'll take a look at America and the waning of the Cold War. Now, a lot of people like to argue that Ronald Reagan is the man responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union, but we'll see in this section that it was more of an internal Soviet thing. The Soviets had years of bad economic conditions, mostly created by themselves in their disastrous war in Afghanistan. They had an intensely repressive government that the people were very, very tired of, and the failed policies of openness by Mikhail Gorbachev didn't really help things either. Indeed, we'll see that in this section, it was more the interior of the Soviet Union rather than Ronald Reagan that spelled the end of the Soviet Union. The late 80s and early 90s saw massive upheavals in terms of the global balance of power between communist and capitalist countries. The Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to transform the Soviet Union into a more modern and successful nation. Unbeknownst to many, the Soviet Union had been slowly deteriorating as its restrictive and insular political and economic policies were slowly weakening the nation, which was also reeling from its own sort of Vietnam-like foreign policy disaster in Afghanistan. To remedy this, Gorbachev tried to implement policies that would open the Soviet Union, reduce some of its more restrictive policies, and reform its economy to engage in more free market approaches. However, it was somewhat too little too late, as many of the Soviet bloc countries quickly fell to revolutions that overthrew their communist governments, as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany, Yugoslavia, and Albania all would effectively become non-communist nations. As this was happening, other major world events would see massive change as well. In South Africa, the long-time standing white supremacist government and its white supremacist policy known as apartheid would lose control, and the African-led party, the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, would take over in 1994. Communist China also experimented with policies of economic openness to a more capitalist approach, but when students there advocated for more political rights in the Tiananmen Square protests in the summer of 1989, the Chinese Communist Party responded brutally as the military would move in on the protests and use live ammunition to disperse the movement. And since the Chinese Communist government doesn't like to share information about how many people it has killed and never has, we still don't know how many people died in that massacre. But we would see communism fall hardest in Russia, as the Soviet Union could no longer maintain its position as the legitimate ruling power over the country. After some failed coups and military interventions, it became evident that the government of Gorbachev and the Communist Party could no longer hold legitimate power over the people of Russia. By August of 1991, Gorbachev would resign his position as the leader of the now powerless Communist Party of Russia. The Soviet Union, the arch-nemesis of the United States for nearly half a century, had ceased to exist. Now, in terms of Reagan's relationship with Gorbachev, Reagan naturally distrusted Gorbachev at first, and that's to be expected, as Reagan normally took a hard stance against the Soviets. However, the relationship between the American and Russian leaders grew more and more cordial, as the two would agree to significantly reduce their nuclear arsenals, mostly because the Russians could no longer really afford to maintain said arsenals after years of economic misfortune and their own disgrace in Afghanistan. But despite the collapse of the Soviets, Reagan's conservative revolution faced serious peril, as a series of scandals would again cause Americans to lose whatever remaining trust they had in their federal government. After years of decreased regulation, it should really come as no surprise that a massive series of corruption scandals would occur within various federal agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There was also a very serious scandal within the savings and loan industry, which was made possible and perhaps enabled by the Reagan administration's deregulation of that industry years earlier. But the biggest scandal of the Reagan administration was the Iran-Contra scandal. Essentially, what had happened was that high-ranking members of Reagan's Department of Defense sold military weapons to the Iranians in a failed effort to get them to release American hostages being held throughout the Middle East. The money from those weapons was then funneled to support the Contra military group that was fighting the communist-leading Sandinistas in Nicaragua. It's also worth noting that the Contras were heavily involved in trafficking narcotics into the United States from South America, so you had the Reagan administration giving drug traffickers money, and you also had the Reagan administration throwing millions of marginalized people in jail for selling those very same drugs to the American people. See? Even the most lethal predator in the house thinks it's messed up. The discovery of the Iran-Contra scandal and the massive media sensation it created would lead to the downfall of many members within the Reagan administration, but not Reagan himself. However, the Republican Party would suffer at the ballot box because of these scandals. Democrats would regain control of the Senate and had hoped to regain the White House, but struggled to find a strong candidate. They would eventually settle with Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis to run against the Republican George H. Bush. Neither candidate would inspire much enthusiasm at all, as William Howard Taft the Cat was far more dynamic than either candidate. However, Bush would ultimately win on an incredibly negative campaign that relentlessly relentlessly attacked Dukakis and painted him as the leader of all that was wrong with liberalism in America. In the now infamous Willie Horton ad of 1988, the Bush campaign employed an inflammatory and subtly racist tactic in which Bush implied that Dukakis was directly responsible for the rape and death of a white woman in Massachusetts because the man who committed the crime, a black felon named Willie Horton, was out of prison on a weekend furlough program that was supported by Dukakis. The negative campaign worked, as Bush would win with 54% of the popular vote and 426 electoral votes to Dukakis's 46% of the popular vote and 112 electoral votes. The Republican strategy of painting Democrats as soft on crime would become a widely used tactic still to this day. The Bush presidency started off well enough as he and Americans wondered in amazement at the new world unfolding before them. Bush maintained cordial relationships with the crumbling Soviet bloc and maneuvered changing world events with a degree of calm that soothed many Americans. However, Bush had a few massive issues that would ultimately doom him to become a one-term president. One, he inherited a huge amount of debt from his predecessor in Ronald Reagan, and he had promised to solve the issue of debt. 2, Bush had promised to institute no new taxes, and it's really hard to promise no new taxes and eliminate debt. 3, Bush faced the political gridlock situation of having a Democratic Congress as a Republican president. The Democrats more or less forced Bush to implement new taxes despite the fact that the president had promised to do the opposite. 4, the economy began to slide into a recession in 1990 as the years of debt mounted by the government and corporations began to take its toll. Because there was so much debt, an alarming amount of businesses closed and declared bankruptcy, causing many Americans to express alarm that their own financial ruin was merely an uninsured medical bill away. As for foreign policy, Bush operated in the rare circumstance of being the leader of the only major world power after the demise of the Soviet Union. Rather than intervene throughout the world to prevent Soviet influence, the United States would use its reduced army to intervene in regional affairs that threatened American influence. Such a threat would emerge in the Middle East as the hostile nation of Iraq, under the control of the military dictator Saddam Hussein, would attempt to seize the small Western-allied and Western-created and supported oil-rich nation of Kuwait. Kuwait was essentially a country created by the West to ensure that Europe and the United States had a relatively cheap and easy access point to the oil reserves of the Persian Gulf region. After Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait, the United States and its allies managed to put together a force of 690,000 troops to expel Iraqis from Kuwait. After about 6 weeks of fighting, American troops invaded the Iraqi capital of Baghdad, forced the Iraqis to surrender and leave Kuwait, thus preserving America and its allies' access to oil in the Persian Gulf. Though the war was relatively painless for the United States, as only 141 American troops died compared to over 100,000 Iraqi troops, it did fail to oust the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein and further radicalized many Arabs throughout the Middle East who worried about the swift and brutal tactics of American intervention. The desire to inflict harm on the United States by any means necessary grew tremendously throughout the region. Though George Bush had a massive amount of public support in the wake of the Gulf War, that shine soon dimmed as the recession of 1991 worsened and he seemed to have no concrete plan to address it. With the Republican candidate looking weak, the 5-term governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, would emerge as the early frontrunner of the Democratic Party with almost no opposition. The election of 1992 would pit the young and incredibly skillful politician that is Clinton against the incumbent George Bush. However, a significant independent candidate would emerge in Texas billionaire Ross Perot. Ross Perot had a voice that was about as funny as his face, but a very blunt manner of speaking. He would run on a campaign that promised to rein in the power of the federal government and promised tough leadership to manage the country out of the economic crisis. Though Perot managed to win an impressive 19% of the popular vote, he won 0 electoral votes and probably took a lot of votes away from George Bush in the process. Clinton would win a clear but not dominant victory in 1992 as the Democrats would again control the presidency and the Congress. Next, we'll look at the 1990s and 2000s as we look at the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations as they struggled to deal with the United States being the lone superpower in the world while also dealing with many of the same issues the United States has always struggled with at home. And the next episode is the last chapter of the Brinkley textbook, which means that's it. There's no more history. Will there be more episodes after it? Well, I guess there'll be more history, but we shall just have to wait and see next time on the APUSHow. Thank you guys, as always, so much for watching. On behalf of myself and William Howard Taft, thanks again, and don't forget, gotta keep pushing, G.